I want to be clear about something before I get into this. I am not a person who uses the word inexplicable. I have been a park ranger for 14 years, and in that time, I have encountered things in forests that scared me, things that surprised me, things that I could not immediately explain, and in every single case I was eventually able to explain them. A sound I could not identify turned out to be a bird I had not heard before. A shape I could not place turned out to be a tree fallen at an angle that my brain read as something else. Forests produce strangeness, the way they produce everything else, abundantly and without apology. And most of that strangeness has a source that a patient and practical person can find if they look long enough. I have been at Holland Creek Nature Preserve for 6 years. I know this forest the way I know my own house in the dark, by feel and by the specific inventory of its sounds and silences. I know what belongs here, and I know what does not. What is in the Della section of this preserve does not belong here in any category I have, and yet here it is. Holland Creek sits in the northern part of Wisconsin, a dense stretch of old-growth hardwood and pine covering nearly 40,000 acres that edges up against the national forest to the north. The town of Dunning is 9 miles south of the main trailhead, a small logging and tourism town that has been reinventing itself in the direction of outdoor recreation for the past couple of decades. The people of Dunning have a relationship with the Holland Creek Forest that goes back further than the preserve designation, further than the town in some cases. And when I first arrived 6 years ago and started talking to the older residents about the land, I noticed that they spoke about the forest with a particular quality of careful respect that I read at the time as regional folklore. I do not read it that way anymore. I transferred to Holland Creek 6 years ago after my marriage ended, and I needed the kind of quiet that the southern part of the state had stopped providing. I'm a practical man, and I wanted a practical life. And a ranger station in the deep north with a small caseload and a lot of empty trail sounded like exactly what I needed. I was right about that. I was wrong about the empty part. The preserve has 3 established trail systems, 2 designated camping areas, and a visitation rate that peaks in the fall and drops to almost nothing once the snow comes in off the lake in November. I manage it mostly alone, with help from a seasonal ranger named Phil who works summers and early fall, and a volunteer trail crew twice a year. It is a good job in a good place, and I would not trade it, which is something I want you to understand before I tell you the rest of this. It was a Tuesday in late September when I heard the first voice. I was doing a routine trail check on the North Loop, which is the longest and most remote of the 3 trail systems, running 11 miles through the deep interior of the preserve before looping back to the trailhead. I was about 3 miles in, moving at my usual pace, paying the kind of attention that becomes automatic after enough years of walking the same trails. The forest around me was doing exactly what late September forest does, leaves coming down in the mild wind, a pair of ravens calling somewhere to the north, the light going amber in the late afternoon in the way it does when the canopy has started to thin for fall. The voice came from the east, off trail, maybe 200 yards in, where the marked path ended and the undesignated interior of the preserve began. I stopped immediately, The first thing you do when you hear an unexpected human sound in a preserve is check it for distress. And this was not distress. It was pitched like conversation, unhurried, the rhythm of someone talking to another person who is listening. I stood still and tried to hear a second voice. I could not, but dense forest absorbs sound unevenly, and a second voice might simply have been on the listening end of the exchange. I called out my standard identification. "Ranger, is anyone out there? Do you need assistance?" The voice stopped. I waited a full minute. I called out again. Nothing came back. I noted the approximate direction and continued the trail check, planning to investigate on the way back. On the way back, the voice was there again. Same direction, same distance, same conversational pitch, as though no time had passed and I had not called out to it 2 hours before. I called out again. It stopped again. I went to the edge of the trail and looked into the trees, and my sight line went about 30 feet before the undergrowth closed it off. I did not go off trail, because a ranger who goes off trail alone in an unmarked section of a 40,000-acre preserve without a clear reason and a clear plan is a ranger who might need someone to come find him. And there was no one to come find me. I drove back to the station and logged it as possible hiker activity in a restricted zone. I sat with my dinner and thought about it. In the morning, I drove to the trailhead and walked the North Loop again. The voice was there at the same location. I drove into Dunning on Thursday evening, the way I drove into town twice a week. The restaurant on the main street was called Birch and Pine, and the owner was a man named Harlan, who had been running the place for 20 years and who was one of the few people in Dunning I would call a genuine friend, without qualification. We ate at the counter, which was our habit, and I told him what I had been hearing. He set down his fork. He asked me where on the North Loop, how far in, which direction off trail. I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was the Della section, which is not a name that appears on any of the preserve's official documentation, but which I had heard Dunning residents use before, the way local people name the parts of land that matter to them in ways that the official designations do not capture. I asked why it was called that. He said there was a family named Della who had a homestead in that section of the woods in the early 1900s. They cleared a few acres and tried to farm the land for about 20 years before the last of them left, and the structure they built had long since collapsed into the forest floor. But people in Dunning had called that part of the woods the Della section for as long as anyone could remember. I said I knew about the old homestead site from the historical survey maps. He said the voice was not something he could explain simply over dinner, but that it was something the people of Dunning had known about for a long time, and that there was something specific I needed to know about it. He said, "If you hear voices in the Della section, run toward them." I looked at him. He said he knew how that sounded. He asked me to hear the rest of it before I decided what to do with it. Then he told the other customers their checks were on the house and asked them to have a good night. And he locked the front door and we moved to the back booth with fresh coffee, and he told me everything. The voices in the Della section had been there for as long as people had been going into that part of the woods. The Della family knew about them. The logging crews who worked that section in the 20s and 30s knew about them. The hunters who had used the area for generations knew about them. The voices sounded like conversation, always at a distance, always moving away from you when you moved toward them. The rule was the oldest piece of knowledge associated with the Della section, passed down through every generation of people who went into those woods. If you heard voices, you moved toward them. You walked directly toward the sound, and the voices moved away, and you followed them. And you kept following them until they stopped, or until they had led you somewhere. I asked where they led you. Harlan said they led you out. They moved away from something in the deep northeast of the Della section, near where the old homestead used to be. And if you followed the voices, they took you away from that thing and eventually brought you to the edge of the preserve, where the forest met the county land. I asked what the thing was. He said nobody in Dunning knew. Nobody had ever claimed to know. What everyone knew was what it did, and what it did was stay in its section of the forest and not come out. And the voices had historically and consistently led people away from it when they followed the rule. I asked, what happened when people did not follow the rule? He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug and said that over the years, a small number of people who went into the Della section came back out not quite right, not physically hurt, not lost in any significant way, but changed in a manner that the people who knew them recognized as wrong, a kind of flatness in how they engaged with the people and places that were familiar to them, as though something in the mechanism of being themselves had been disrupted. He said it did not happen to everyone who ignored the rule, and it did not always happen immediately, but it happened often enough and consistently enough over a long enough time that the people of Dunning worked out the rule and made sure it was passed on. If you hear voices, run toward them, not away, toward. I drove back to the preserve that night on roads I had driven 100 times, and the forest on either side of the highway looked the same as it always looked, dark and deep and familiar. I thought about 6 years of trail checks on the North Loop. I thought about how many times I had been 3 miles in and turned around before I ever heard anything. I thought about what I had not heard on all the days I had not gone far enough. I called my friend Dean the following week. Dean lives in Warsaw, and we have been hiking and camping together since we met at a ranger certification course 12 years ago. He is experienced and reliable, and he is the kind of person who can hear a strange thing and respond to it practically, rather than trying to immediately flatten it into something more comfortable. I told him everything Harlan had said and told him I wanted to go into the Della section on a day hike with a second person, GPS units for both of us, full day packs, and a clear plan for what we would do if we heard voices. He drove up on a Saturday. We went in early on Sunday morning, the day cold and overcast, the light in the forest, the flat white of an October sky with no sun behind it. We left the North Loop Trail at the point where I had been hearing the voice and pushed east into the trackless section, using the GPS to hold our bearing and the old survey maps to navigate toward the approximate location of the homestead site. I had been clear with Dean about the plan. If we heard voices, we moved toward them, and we did not stop moving toward them, and we did not turn around for any reason. He had asked what the any reason covered. I said I thought he would know it when he heard it, and that when he heard it, the most important thing he could do was not look back. He had looked at me for a long moment and then said, "All right." The Della section felt different from the rest of the preserve. I had been trying to decide for 3 weeks whether that was something I was reading into it or something that was actually there, and walking into it with Dean, watching his face as we went deeper, I could see him registering the same difference without being told to look for it. The trees were larger, the undergrowth was denser, the bird sounds were fewer, and the wind in the canopy created a low, continuous sound that enclosed you the way the sound of a large building encloses you, a sound that says the space you are in is very large and you are very small inside it. We walked for 40 minutes without incident. Then I heard the voice. It was ahead and to the left, northeast, in the direction of the old homestead site. The same quality I had been hearing from the trail for 2 weeks, conversational and unhurried, the sound of someone talking to a patient listener, the words not quite resolving into anything I could understand, no matter how hard I strained to hear them. I stopped walking and grabbed Dean's arm. He heard it too. He looked at me and nodded. We moved toward it. It moved. Harlan had described this, and I had understood it intellectually, and experiencing it was different from understanding it, the way most things are. The voice maintained its distance with a precision that felt deliberate, not running, not frightened, just staying ahead of us at the same interval, regardless of whether we walked or jogged. We pushed through undergrowth and over downed logs and through a low, wet area that soaked both our boots, and the voice stayed in the trees ahead of us, always just far enough that we could hear it clearly and see nothing. Always that same calm conversational pitch that had no urgency in it except the urgency of its movement. Then I heard the other sound. It came from behind us and to the right, from the direction of the homestead site, southeast of where we were, the direction we had been walking away from. I cannot tell you what it sounded like in any way that will satisfy you, and I have tried many times in the months since to find a description that is accurate rather than dramatic. It was low and continuous, and it had a quality of mass to it, the sound of something with significant physical presence moving through the underbrush without concern for the noise it was making. Things in forests that do not need to worry about predators, do not worry about the noise they make. This thing was not worrying about the noise it made, and it was not moving away from us. I grabbed Dean's jacket and told him to keep moving toward the voice and not to look back. He looked at my face. He did not ask any questions. He kept moving. I want to tell you that I was calm. I was not calm. I was doing the thing that you do when you have made a decision in advance about how you are going to behave in a specific situation, and the situation has arrived and the decision is the only thing standing between you and a different choice that you know would be wrong. I had decided not to look back. I had decided it sitting at the ranger station a week before, quietly and without drama, the way I made most of my decisions, and I held on to that decision for 20 minutes through dense October forest, while something moved through the trees behind me, and the voice stayed ahead of me, and Dean ran without asking why. We ran toward the voice for 20 minutes. It stopped. We were standing in a clearing, a natural opening in the canopy where the trees thinned enough to let the grey October sky through. 30 yards across, roughly circular, a deer trail crossing it west to east. To the east, the deer trail led toward the edge of the preserve, where the forest met the county land, less than a mile from a road. The sound from behind us was gone. I realized I could not say exactly when it had stopped, only that it had stopped at some point during the run, and I had not noticed because I had been focused entirely on the voice ahead of me, which is, I think, exactly how it was supposed to work. Dean and I stood in the clearing and breathed. After a while, he said, "The voice was leading us out." I said, "Yes." He said, "And the thing behind us was what it was leading us away from." I said I believed so. We followed the deer trail east and came out onto the county road 40 minutes later. I checked the GPS. We were 2.5 miles north of where we had left the trail. The voices had taken us northeast, away from the homestead site, and put us out at the nearest available exit from the forest. We drove back to the ranger station without saying very much. In the weeks that followed, I had conversations with the older residents of Dunning, the way you have conversations in a small town, naturally, and in the places where people gathered in the course of ordinary days. I was not going around asking pointed questions. I was doing what I had learned to do in 6 years of community relationships, which was listen well and be patient and let people tell me what they were ready to tell me. A woman named Faye, in her mid-80s, told me about her grandfather who had worked the logging crews in the Della section in the 1920s. She said he talked about the voices his whole life, always matter-of-factly, the way he talked about other features of the work. The logging crews knew the rule and followed it, and nobody on her grandfather's crew had a problem. She said in the logging camps, the rule was treated as a safety procedure, passed from foreman to foreman, the same way you pass down the practical knowledge of how not to get killed by a tree. She said her grandfather believed the thing in the Della section was old, older than the forest. He said it felt like something the forest had grown up around, rather than something that lived in the forest. And he was a practical man who did not say things like that casually. And he said it anyway, because it was the most accurate thing he could find to say. An older man named Clyde had spent 30 years as a hunting guide in the Holland Creek area. He told me he gave the rule to every client before any hunt that went into the north section. He said most of them thought he was doing the thing guides sometimes did with new clients, local mythology as a kind of hazing, and he let them think that because it did not matter what they thought about the reason, as long as they followed the instruction. He said the problem came when someone heard the second sound and turned to run from it, instead of toward the voices, because running from the second sound meant running away from the voices, which meant running toward whatever the voices were leading you away from. I asked how he knew this. He said he had a client in 1987 who heard the second sound and ran the wrong way. He found the man 20 minutes later sitting against a tree at the edge of the homestead clearing, physically unhurt, perfectly still, looking at nothing in the specific way of someone who has seen the inside of something they were not built to look at. He said the man stood up when Clyde touched his shoulder and walked out of the woods without speaking and drove home, and that Clyde heard later, through people, they both knew that the man had not gone back entirely to the version of himself he had been before. He functioned He had a life, just not the same one, in the same way. I asked if there were others. Clyde said yes. He did not want to name them. He said Dunning was a small town and the people he was thinking of were still here, or their families were, and there was nothing useful in pointing at them. He said they were fine, they had lives, they went about the business of being people, just not quite the same people they had been before they went into the Della section and ran from what they should have run toward. I had to decide what to do with what I knew. I am a ranger. I have responsibilities to this preserve and to the public and to the systems I work within. And not one of those systems has a category for what I am dealing with. I could not post a sign. I could not file a report that accurately described the situation without producing questions I could not answer through any channel that existed for answering them. What I could do was what the people of Dunning had always done. I updated the preserve's visitor orientation materials to include language about the Deep North section, recommending that visitors stay on marked trails and treat any sounds they could not identify as a signal to move toward the nearest marked trail. I framed it as a disorientation issue, specific to the dense canopy and terrain, which was true as far as it went, and which gave people a practical instruction without requiring them to believe anything they were not equipped to believe. If you are in the Della section and you follow that instruction, you will be moving towards the voices, because the voices come from the direction of the marked trails. The instruction and the rule point the same way. I made sure of that. I also talked to Harlan and asked him to keep doing what he had apparently always done, which was tell the rule directly to anyone he thought was going to spend real time in those woods. He said he had been doing it for 20 years and he intended to keep doing it. I asked how he knew who to tell. He said you could usually tell. He said the people who were going to hear the voices had a quality to the way they talked about the forest they were going into, an attentiveness to the place, and those were the people who needed the rule. He said he had told it to maybe 30 people over the years, and not one of them had come back to him with a problem. I said the rule worked. I said it simply because it was simply true and required no argument. I am writing this in February at the ranger station. There is 2 feet of snow on the preserve, and the trailheads are closed, and the forest outside the window is doing what it does in the months when the people are gone, which is exist in the deep quiet of a northern winter, patient and complete and entirely itself. I think about the Della section in the winter. I think about whatever is in the northeast corner near the old homestead site, in the snow and the cold and the silence of a forest that nobody visits for months. I think about whether it is dormant in winter or whether it is exactly as present as it is in October. And I have decided that I do not need to know the answer to that question in order to do my job, and that not needing to know is itself a kind of knowledge that I have worked to earn. I want to say something directly to anyone reading this who spends time in old forests, the genuinely old sections of genuinely old places, the parts of wild land that have been what they are for longer than anyone living can account for. If you hear voices that sound like conversation coming from somewhere off your trail or off your route, voices that move away from you when you move toward them, voices that stay ahead of you at a consistent distance, no matter how you adjust your pace. Pay attention to what I am telling you. Move toward them. Walk directly toward the sound and keep walking toward it. You are not trying to find the source. You are not going to find the source. The point is the direction, not the destination. And the direction the voices are leading you is away from the thing you do not want to meet, toward the edge of the dangerous area, toward the open land on the other side of the trees. If you hear a second sound, a sound that is not the voices, a sound that comes from behind you and has the quality of something with mass moving in your direction, without concern for the noise it is making, do not stop. Do not turn around. Do not try to see what it is. I made a decision in advance not to look back. And that decision is the reason I am sitting in this ranger station in February, writing this account, instead of being a different version of myself, the flattened version, the one that functions but is not entirely home in its own life. Move towards the voices. Keep moving. The old forests have their own rules the same way rivers have currents and weather has seasons. And the rule in the Della section is the clearest rule I have ever been given about how to be safe in a specific piece of wild land. I was given it by a man in a restaurant who knew it because people before him had worked it out at a cost I do not want to think about too carefully, and I am passing it on the same way, because that is how rules like this stay alive, person to person, the way the oldest and most important knowledge has always traveled. The forest will make you an offer in the Della section. It will put voices in the trees ahead of you, conversational and unhurried. And the offer is this: follow us and we will take you out. The offer is genuine. In all the accounts I have gathered from all the people of Dunning who have known about this place for all the years they have known about it, the offer has never been false. Follow the voices and they take you out every time. The only question is whether you trust them enough to run toward them instead of away. In 6 weeks, the snow will start to recede and the trailheads will open and the spring hikers will arrive at the Holland Creek Nature Preserve, and I will be at the orientation kiosk with the trail maps and the safety guidelines and the information that keeps people alive in these 40,000 acres. I will tell them about the wildlife and the weather and the trail conditions, and I will tell them to stay on marked paths in the north section and to move toward the marked trails if they hear anything they cannot identify. I will tell them all the rules, and for the ones who have that quality Harlan described, the attentiveness to the place, the ones who are going to go deep enough to hear what is in the Della section, I will tell them the rest of it, quietly and without drama, the way Harlan told me over coffee in a locked restaurant on a Thursday night, the same way the foreman told the logging crews, the same way Clyde told every client on the first morning of every season, the same way the people of Dunning have been telling each other for longer than anyone alive can trace it back. If you hear voices in the woods, run toward them, not away, toward, and do not look back.